Semicolons are often abused by people, and the reason for that is that people tend to think that a semicolon is basically just a longer pause. So if a comma won't do the job, then use a semicolon. But that's not what semicolons are for, and in this video we want to talk about the major rules for semicolons, particularly the first one, which covers about 90% of the cases. And if you understand these rules, then you can apply them to your writing, and your writing will be more stylish and more professional. Let's start with rule number 1. Semicolons are allowed to be used between independent clauses. So if you look at the first example, the war was finally over, peace settled quietly on the land, we have two clauses here. The first one is the war was finally over, so that's our first independent clause. And then after the semicolon, we have another independent clause, peace settled quietly on the land. What makes these independent is that they can stand by themselves as a complete sentence. If you were to add something to the first clause, for instance, if you were to say, when the war was finally over, peace settled quietly on the land, that would be a complete sentence, but now the first clause is no longer independent. When the war was finally over, you can't have that as a complete sentence by itself. So in that case, we would need a comma to connect the two parts of the sentence. As it is, though, we don't have when here, so these are two independent clauses. And here comes the next bit, the next criterion. If both of these clauses are connected or related in theme and content, so in other words, if they're about the same topic and they're kind of interacting with each other, then we can connect them with the semicolon. In this case, we have a very nice contrast between the two clauses. So the first deals with war, the second with peace, and they kind of nicely fit together. Let's look at the next example and see if this one could also be connected with a semicolon. It reads, there is not much difference between husbandry, which is farming, and having a husband. Both involve taking care of lazy pigs. Not my opinion necessarily, but some people might say that. So here we have a colon at the moment. And the reason for that is that even though both of these clauses, so the first and the second one here, both of these are independent, you could put them by themselves as complete sentences. The truth is that the second one tends to zoom in more than the first. So if the second clause is more specific and detailed and often explains the first, as in this example, then we want to use a colon and not a semicolon. And the last thing to realize here is that sometimes you can have two clauses, as in the last sentence here, he left, she wept. And we could use a semicolon here because they're both independent clauses, but these are such short clauses that it's okay to use a comma. This is not standard in academic writing, but in more casual kinds of writing, the comma is perfectly fine. So again, the major rule then is to use semicolons between two independent clauses that are related in theme and content. Now that we know the major rule for semicolon use, we're ready to look at a couple of minor exceptions. So in this example, what we have is again two independent clauses. So we have I am all for phasing out coal power plants. That's our first independent clause. And then our second one starts with I and ends with up. So here we say, I would like to know if my electricity bill will go up. And that's another independent clause. What we have done, though, is we have added a little transitional expression in between them. So however is what's called a conjunctive adverb. Conjunctive adverb. And this conjunction basically ties the two parts of the sentence together. Now, it is important to know that we can't use just any kind of conjunction here. So we should not be using coordinating conjunctions. And if you remember, those are the fanboys, right? They are for, or, and nor, and but, and yet, and so. And if you rearrange them, then you'll get the acronym fanboys. We should not be using a semicolon before one of these. We should be using a comma in front of those. But if we have a conjunctive adverb or some other transitional expression, if we say, for instance, at the same time, And we can use other expressions too. We could say nevertheless or something like that, even so. There's another one. All of these transitional expressions can come right after the semicolon. They're usually followed up with a comma, and then we get our second independent clause. Let's move on to our second exception to our general rule. Now, just a minute ago, I said that you should not use a semicolon before a coordinating conjunction, but I lied. Sometimes you are allowed to do this. You're allowed to break that rule, but only very rarely, and here's how it goes. So if you have a semicolon, as in this instance, and you have your coordinating conjunction, there's but, that's just one of the 7 fanboys. And then you also have to have on either side an independent clause. So there's one, and there's one on the other side of but as well, starting with the book. In this case, if these clauses are quite long and convoluted and have a lot of internal punctuation, so here we have lots of commas, then you're allowed to use a semicolon here just to add a little bit of clarification. So the semicolon just creates a little bit more order to the sentence. And we can read now, the film was mesmerizing and I really enjoyed the ending with its special effects, lots of qualifications. Then the semicolon comes in and then the coordinating conjunction, and we can keep going after that. So this is fairly rare, but you are allowed to add that semicolon before the coordinating conjunction, and just do it very selectively where you have quite a complex sentence. So far we've seen that semicolons should be used between independent clauses, and we've looked at a couple of exceptions to that rule as well. We're going to end with one final rule, which is that you're allowed to use a semicolon in a list with internal punctuation. So let's see what that actually means. We have a list here with 3 items in it. We have Timothy, the son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father. We have Lydia, a seller of purple dye goods. And we have the Philippian jailer. Now, as you can see, we've used semicolons to divide these items in a list. So there's 2 semicolons here. The reason is that we also have commas in our list. So there are a few commas as well. And these commas are referred to as internal punctuation. The result then is that if we have all commas, because usually in a list we would just use commas, so we would go 1, 2, 3, 3 items and a comma after the first and the second. But now we also have commas in between. This would get very confusing, and it would be difficult for the reader to tell which commas are the final commas for each item in the list. So what we've done simply is to make these commas into semicolons, and now it's much clearer where the dividing break actually is. So what we've seen then in this video is that semicolons should be used very selectively, mostly just to tie 2 independent clauses together, clauses that are not related yet with conjunctions, but that are similar in content and in what they're talking about. We've looked at a couple of exceptions, and then we've seen that very rarely you can also use them in a list just to add a little bit of clarification.